FOP is a profoundly disabling, ultra-rare genetic disorder that causes muscles and tendons and ligaments, the body's connective tissue, to turn into bone. And eventually, it locks the joints and makes moving completely impossible. Children born with FOP look normal at birth, except for a telltale malformation of the great toe. And then about 2 to 5 years of age, painful swellings that look like tumors seize the skeletal muscles and slowly transform them into bone. Minor bumps and bruises can cause FOP to raise its ugly head. It's a very cruel condition because it seals independence away from children. It's the worst condition that I have ever seen. One of the aspects of scientific discovery that can't be learned by reading papers in medical journals is the stories that are behind it. In 2006, we discovered the gene that causes FOP, but it was a long, long journey up the mountain to find that gene. It was a matter of involving the families, involving other scientists, involving other doctors. It was a worldwide effort, a worldwide campaign, a worldwide war to find the cause of FOP. So let me tell you some of the stories of that war.
Our story with FOP started 30 years ago when my son was just about to turn 5. Ian's onset was the typical big edema, swellings. He was misdiagnosed, as many children are. I got told my son had FOP over the phone by my husband. At that moment, I felt like the oxygen that I had breathed all my life had just been sucked out of me. I'm not sure I've ever had that same volume of oxygen in my life ever since.
Hayden was diagnosed with FOP when he was 2.5. It was in September of 2002. Like most kids with FOP, he was originally diagnosed with cancer. They were going to do deep tissue biopsy, which would have been horrible for him. And a nurse practitioner walked in and overheard them talking and said, "By chance, does he have malformed big toes?" And the doctor said, "Yes." And she said, don't do the biopsy. I think he has this rare genetic condition." It was really hard to believe that your child has this disease, that a disease that can do that actually exists, where it grows extra bone. And obviously we had never heard of this before. And for both Hayden's dad and I, it was devastating. It was, they didn't even know what caused it.
My FOP journey began actually when I was 3.5, but 6 months prior to the FOP diagnosis, I was diagnosed with cancer. They amputated my right arm. They said there was nothing they could do. The right arm had to come off and they couldn't save it. And 6 months later is when we got the phone call. It was Memorial Day weekend, 1985, and the doctor said she has FOP. Basically, good luck. She might see her 10th birthday. You're alone in the world.
There weren't enough people, he told me, to really go after it. And he said, "And don't try Mrs. Kirby, and you'll never find another one. You'll never find another. We don't know of any in Georgia."
I remember sitting in front of the doctor with Sarah on my lap facing him, and the x-ray of her head showed little white signs of the beginning of bone, and the radiologist said, "What do her toes look like?" And he knew it was FOP, and he said, there's no treatment. It's very, very rare. Nobody's gonna study it. It was pretty bleak.
Back in 2001, Whitney said her neck hurt, and she said that she pushed a basketball up in the air and felt a crack in her neck. As the days went on, the movement in her neck started getting less and less. I just had a pit in my stomach. Something wasn't right. Whitney was diagnosed with FOP April 3rd, 2001. It took me a year to learn how to say Fibrodysplasia, Ossificans, Progressiva. It took me a year to learn how to say that word.
It was very different. It was just a different time. There were 83 or 84 known families around the world. I think there were maybe 6 or 8 published articles on FOP. That's it. No internet, no movies, no news coverage, no articles.
We went to the library, and there was about this much written on the disease at the time in our little public library.
The only real support we had was we had a Yahoo group that was an email group that you could email the group and ask questions. And sometimes you would get answers, sometimes you wouldn't get answers. You were really on your own, literally.
It's so isolating. It's so pathetically isolating. And so you reinvent life.
My introduction to FOP occurred in the mid-1980s, and I had seen two adults who had FOP. They were in their 40s and 50s, and they were locked in bone. They couldn't move. I thought, gee, this is very unusual. Why are these adults locked in bone? I had trained as an orthopedic surgeon, and I had seen a lot, but I'd never seen anything like this.
I first became involved with FOP in the mid-70s. I was at the NIH and decided to take a fellowship in genetics. And this introduced me to many genetic disorders of humans that I had never been exposed to. And one day I was introduced to this beautiful little girl. She must have been 8 years old. She was in the clinic because she had been at a carnival, and during one of the rides she just turned her neck. And later in the evening, the parents noted that her neck on one side was absolutely swollen and red hot. I learned subsequently that when she was 2, a large mass had appeared on the side of her knee joint, and that had been removed surgically and had left as a response to surgery a very large mass of bone. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. I learned that this was Fibrodysplasia Ossificans Progressiva, a condition that I knew nothing about. There was no other condition that was known, none, that had that biological characteristic. And I found that absolutely, from a scientific perspective, fascinating. And that was sufficient for me to say, I'm going to spend some time on this. One by one, I began to acquire more patients. One of those patients was a woman named Jeannie Pieper. It became clear from discussions with Jeannie that she didn't really know any other FOP patients. At that point, if you had a rare disease, you were isolated. Your doctors didn't know anything about it. You couldn't find anything in the books. There was absolutely no way, except through a central physician who was caring, but there were no significant number of physicians taking care of FOP. And with Jeannie, she began really, I had very little to do with this, to communicate with the individuals with FOP who I knew, and she began to assemble a community. And the IFOPA began ultimately as a consequence of her efforts. In 1990, I left NIH and was recruited actually to Penn. I found myself in a situation where I couldn't take care of these kids anymore. I didn't have the resources. But I had come across work by a guy named Kaplan, Fred Kaplan, in the orthopedics department.
I was at Children's Hospital seeing another patient, and I met Michael Zasloff. And he said to me, have you ever heard of a condition called Fibrodysplasia Ossificans Progressiva? I said, oh, FOP? Of course I have. I have two adults who have FOP.
I had a laboratory. He didn't. He was really much a clinician. And we began to talk.
He said, you should come to my laboratory and we should work on this together. And I said, I don't think so. You don't want me in your laboratory. And then he paused and he looked at me and he said, have you ever seen a child who has FOP? And I said, no. And he said, next week I'm going to see a little girl from North Carolina. And he said, can you come? I said, absolutely. So I came and I saw this little girl, and I saw not what FOP did, but what FOP was doing. It was basically transforming this child into immobility. At that moment, I realized that the stage for FOP is children. And I said, this is not an adult disease, this is a child's disease, a disease of childhood. And Michael looked at me and he said, we should work on this together. Nobody is working on this. I said, I'm not a scientist. And he said, you can teach me bones and I'll teach you science, I'll teach you molecules. You come into my lab and we'll work on this. That day changed my life.